Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into a mystery that sits just at the edge of what we can understand, yet feels strangely familiar every time we experience a moment of déjà vu or sense that something in the world has shifted in a way we can't quite explain. We'll be exploring temporal anomalies and what might happen when parallel timelines gently slide toward one another, brushing like drifting clouds sharing the same breeze. But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a joy to see the constellation of places we gather from, each glowing softly in its own corner of time. Now, feel free to dim the lights, let your shoulders fall a little more deeply into your pillow, and perhaps let the quiet hum of a fan become the background companion to your wandering thoughts. Tonight we'll walk gently into the idea that reality may not be one single thread, but something more like a woven cloth, where other strands sometimes come close enough for us to sense their warmth. And if your mind drifts or softens along the way, that's perfectly fine. Just let it wander. The story will be here, unfolding quietly, waiting for you at whatever pace you arrive. So, when you're ready, let's step softly into our first reflection on the nature of time and the illusion of a single path. For most of your life, time has likely felt like a straight, familiar road. You wake, you move through your day, and the hours line up behind you like stepping stones on a quiet trail. The past recedes, the future approaches, and the present moment becomes the only place where your feet truly touch the ground. It's a comforting rhythm, one we rarely question. Time seems to march forward in a simple, unwavering line, as steady as your heartbeat and as predictable as the sun rising each morning. But when you look more closely, the simplicity begins to fade. The road of time is less like a ruler and more like a river. It bends gently, slows in places, rushes in others, and from certain viewpoints, it can even appear to run differently depending on who is watching. Physicists often describe this with carefully crafted equations and symbols, but here we can imagine it more softly. Think of time as a flowing stream, and each of us as leaves drifting along the surface. The water may look smooth, but just beneath it are swirling currents and hidden paths we never feel directly. Our sense of a single timeline comes largely from how our minds work. The brain is always searching for order. It strings our experiences together like beads on a thread, creating a story of before and after, so the world feels stable and familiar. But this is a story told from the inside. It's personal, local, shaped by our own tiny window into the vastness around us. Reality, on its grander scale, may be far less constrained. Modern physics hints at something more intricate. Instead of a single pathway, the universe may resemble a great tapestry woven from countless threads, each carrying its own version of events. In this view, what we call the timeline is just one of many fibres running parallel, with others branching away in gentle arcs. If you picture a tree with endless twigs growing from every branch, you begin to sense how reality might be organised, not as a straight road, but as an ever-growing network. Even this image, though, only captures a small part of the idea. Some physicists imagine that reality doesn't choose one outcome over another. Instead, every possible path unfurls somewhere, creating a landscape where different histories coexist like shadows cast by the same flame. These aren't shadows in a frightening sense, but more like soft reflections in a series of overlapping mirrors, each one showing the world with a slightly different tilt. And yet, from inside your everyday experience, none of this feels real. You don't sense 1,000 possibilities unfolding at once. You sense this moment, the one where you're lying comfortably, listening to a quiet voice, breathing in and out at your own calm pace. Your mind forms a single line from yesterday to today, It's a kind of gentle illusion, one that makes life easier to navigate, but one that might not reveal everything happening beneath the surface. Some researchers describe time not as something absolute, but as something relational, defined by how objects and observers interact. A moment that feels long to you might feel short to someone else. A clock far away from gravity ticks at a slightly different rhythm than one here on Earth. None of these differences are dramatic enough to disturb daily life, but they remind us that time is not as rigid as it seems. You can picture it like threads woven by different hands, similar but not identical. If the universe truly holds many paths, then the one we walk may simply be the one our senses can follow most easily. Perhaps there are other nearby trails, faint but real, where events unfold a little differently. They may never intersect with ours, or they may drift close enough that for a moment their presence softens the air around us in ways we barely notice. That first shiver of déjà vu, that slight mismatch between memory and moment, these could be nothing more than the brain's quirks, or they could be the gentlest brush of another path gliding nearby. This session isn't meant to prove or disprove anything. It's simply an invitation to loosen the grip on the straight-line story we carry in our minds. To imagine that the world might be wider, more intricate, and more mysterious than the simple timeline we see. Like soft ripples spreading across a pond, reality might have layers and echoes that gently overlap, each adding its own quiet shimmer to the whole. And as we settle into this thought, we can begin to explore what happens when those layers drift a little closer, and the boundary between stories becomes soft enough to feel. If you close your eyes for a moment, you might picture the universe as a single vast room. A room so enormous that no wall can be seen, no ceiling can be reached, and no floor can be found beneath your feet. It is the kind of room where everything that has ever happened, or will happen, seems to fit neatly inside one continuous space. This is how reality often feels to us, whole, singular, and self-contained. But there is a growing idea in modern physics that this comforting room may not be alone. Instead, it may be just one chamber in a boundless mansion, with doors we cannot yet see and corridors that unfold into unseen wings. Scientists sometimes call this idea the multiverse, but the word itself can sound sharp and mathematical, so here we can soften it. Imagine instead a vast orchard at night. Countless trees stretch into the quiet distance, their branches illuminated by faint moonlight. Each tree grows from the same soil, but its branches reach in directions the others do not. Some grow straight, some twist gently, some bloom early, some late. Now picture each tree as a version of reality, similar enough to belong to the same orchard, yet different enough to stand apart. This gentle forest of possibilities helps us imagine what the universe might be like if it does not insist on being only one story. In some branches of physics, this orchard grows because the universe does not choose a single outcome when events unfold. Instead, every possibility grows its own branch, like new twigs sprouting from the bark of time. Rather than collapsing into one path, reality unfolds in countless directions at once. Beneath the language of equations, you can imagine this process as a painter, dipping a brush into many colours and letting each droplet fall onto the canvas, each forming its own soft circle. Nothing is discarded. Everything that could happen does, each in its own quiet corner. This idea may sound fantastical, but it arises from trying to understand how the smallest parts of nature behave. When physicists look at particles, those tiny sparks that form the foundation of everything, they find that these sparks do not always obey the simple rules of everyday life. They can be in more than one state at once, like a whisper echoing in two directions. They can take several paths through space without choosing just one. They can linger in possibility until something nudges them into clarity. To describe this, scientists use symbols and wave patterns. Here, though, we can think of it as a small lantern placed on a dark path. Instead of shining a single beam forward, the lantern casts several faint glows at once, one slightly to the left, another slightly to the right, another drifting upward like a firefly. Each glow represents a possible journey, and when the lantern finally settles on one direction, the others fade like dreams upon waking. But somewhere, in another corner of the orchard, those other glows may continue onward, following the stories they were meant to tell. If the universe truly behaves this way, then our timeline, the one we walk each day, may be just one beam of light among many. We experience this one because our senses, our memories, and our bodies are woven into it like threads in a familiar cloth. But the other threads may still exist, running parallel, sometimes drifting close, sometimes far. These threads could carry quiet echoes of ourselves making different choices, taking different steps, speaking different words. Not in a dramatic or frightening way, but simply as part of the fabric of possibility. Some thinkers imagine these parallel paths as pages in a book, each page telling the same story in a slightly different rhythm. If you could flip through them quickly, the story would blur together, the differences almost invisible. But if you paused long enough on each page, you might notice small changes. A sentence rephrased, an extra footstep on the floor, a breath taken sooner or later. Most of the time, these pages never touch. They rest side by side without merging. But in certain theories, the pages might ripple or shift, brushing lightly against one another, and when they do, the words on one page might faintly dye the words on another. This doesn't mean that multiple worlds collide violently or create chaos. Instead, if such brushing occurs, it might feel like the softest disturbance in the corner of awareness, a moment that repeats itself without warning, a memory that feels slightly misplaced, as if borrowed from a version of you with a slightly different past, or a feeling that something familiar has changed in a way you can't quite name, like a room you've always known but with a picture frame slightly tilted. And even if physics eventually reveals that timelines never touch, the very act of imagining them opens our minds to how delicate and mysterious the world truly is. Reality may not be a single, unbroken line, but a gentle branching of possibilities, each one quietly following its own thread. If you allow yourself to picture these threads as soft strands of light weaving through the darkness, you might begin to sense how the universe could be more abundant and intricate than the simple story we experience each day. As we drift deeper into this exploration, it becomes easier to imagine those strands drifting near each other, close enough to tremble with a shared vibration, close enough for hints of one path to shimmer momentarily across another. If you imagine the universe as a vast tapestry, each thread representing a possible version of events, then most of the time these threads run quietly beside one another. They do not tangle, they do not weave into knots, and they do not cross over in ways that disturb the smoothness of the pattern. They simply flow, each telling its own soft story. But some ideas in modern physics suggest that, under certain rare conditions, these threads might drift close enough to touch. The touch is not loud or violent. It is more like two strands of silk brushing together in the slightest breeze. Yet even the gentlest contact could leave a faint shimmering trace. To understand how such a thing might be possible, we can return to the idea that reality is not a single, rigid structure but something more fluid. Instead of thinking of the universe as a single unbending path, imagine it as a pool of quiet water. If you touch the surface lightly with your fingertip, ripples spread outward. Touch it again from a slightly different angle, and new ripples appear, moving in their own directions. Sometimes these circles of motion overlap. Where they meet, the water's surface ripples in patterns slightly different from either of the original waves. This simple image offers a gentle way to think about how different timelines might create faint echoes that meet somewhere in the middle. Some branches of physics describe the universe in terms of a kind of delicate wave pattern beneath everything we see. These patterns guide how particles move and how reality unfolds. When people talk about worlds splitting or timelines branching, what they are often describing is how these underlying waves form new shapes. Normally, these shapes separate cleanly. One ripple leads to another, and the universe settles into its many possibilities like dust settling across a vast landscape. But under the right circumstances, two of these wave patterns could drift into alignment again, their peaks and valleys lining up just long enough to create a shared shimmer. Translated into simple words, this means that two versions of reality might resonate for a moment, like two violin strings tuned almost, but not perfectly the same. When one is gently plucked, the other vibrates faintly in sympathy. The second string does not leap across the room or try to fuse with the first. It merely hums from the same touch of energy, sharing a whisper of sound. This image helps us imagine how two timelines might feel each other's presence, not by colliding physically, but by vibrating along similar patterns in the deeper fabric of existence. Some physicists use the term interference to describe what happens when two waves share the same space. Here, instead of thinking of interference as something sharp or technical, we can picture it as overlapping shadows on a wall. One shadow is soft and rounded, another is a little longer and more slender. When they overlap, the shape becomes something subtly new. It doesn't replace the original shadows. It simply shows that two shapes can share the same surface for a moment and create a combined impression. In the world of timelines, such overlapping moments could create effects so subtle that our minds can barely recognize them. A slight feeling of familiarity, a moment repeating itself, a dreamlike sense that two outcomes are tugging at your attention at once. Sometimes this idea is illustrated with paths in the forest. Picture yourself walking along a quiet trail, soft soil beneath your feet. Ahead, the path branches into two, each leading to different clearings. In one version of the story, you turn left. In another, you turn right. As the hours pass, the two paths wind through different trees and hills. But perhaps far ahead they return to the same valley, close enough that someone standing there might catch hints of both routes. Footsteps that come from slightly different directions, scents of pine carried on two different breezes. The valley does not demand that the paths merge. It simply becomes a place where the echoes of both trails can be felt. In physics, there are also ideas that explore how the universe might curve back on itself in gentle, unexpected ways. These aren't curves like the sharp turns on a road map, but more like the way a piece of cloth folds naturally if you lift it by its corners. If the fabric of time ever bends back softly, two different moments could end up closer than they were before, allowing their stories to hover near each other. Some researchers imagine loops of time where events circle back, not to repeat in a strict cycle, but to drift close enough that subtle exchanges can occur, a little like two quiet dancers changing places without ever disturbing the music. Even on a cosmic scale, the universe might allow moments where separate regions come into contact. In some theories of the early universe, vast cosmic bubbles formed and expanded like droplets of oil spreading across the surface of a warm pan. Most droplets floated separately, but occasionally two bubbles touched. Where they did, the boundaries between them created faint imprints, soft scars, patterns in the light that still echo across the sky. In this way, even the universe itself carries memories of places where separate expansions briefly brushed together before continuing on their own paths. All of this offers a gentle way to imagine convergence, not as crashing worlds, but as whispers exchanged between distant rooms, not as chaos, but as soft harmonies momentarily aligned. If timelines are threads, then convergence might be one thread drifting close enough to share a bit of its colour with another. If timelines are ripples, then convergence might be a place where two ripples cross, each altering the other in the softest of ways. And if timelines are pages in a cosmic book, then convergence might be a faint smudge where the ink of one page presses lightly onto the next. As we hold these images quietly in mind, the idea of timelines brushing against one another becomes less like a paradox and more like a gentle possibility woven into the edges of existence. There are moments in life when time seems to pause, just for a breath. You might be standing in a room you've never visited before, hearing a sentence spoken for the first time, watching sunlight fall across a table in a way you've never seen, and yet something inside you whispers, quietly but unmistakably, "I've been here." The sensation drifts through you like a warm breeze carrying the faint scent of a memory you can't fully grasp. It fades as quickly as it comes, leaving behind a soft ripple of wonder. This familiar strangeness is what we call déjà vu. Most explanations frame it as a simple slip within the brain, a moment when your internal machinery stutters and plays the same moment twice. But there is another way to imagine it, one that pairs gently with our exploration of parallel timelines. To picture déjà vu as something more than a glitch, imagine yourself walking through a meadow just after dawn. On the fresh grass, you see two sets of footprints. One is your own, made as you walked only moments ago. The other set, slightly offset, slightly lighter, seems almost identical. The two paths move in the same direction, sometimes overlapping, sometimes drifting apart. The second set feels familiar, almost as though it belongs to a version of you moving just beside your own trail, half present, half forgotten. Déjà vu could be the moment you notice these twin paths, a brief recognition that another version of you may have stepped here too, following a similar but not identical route. This isn't meant to claim that parallel selves literally walk beside us. Instead, it offers a gentle way to think about why certain experiences feel echoed, why some moments resonate as though they belong to more than one memory. In the soft language of physics, this could be described as overlapping possibilities, two branches of reality whose subtle vibrations align for the smallest fraction of a second. But here, we don't need the heavy tools of science. We only need to imagine two lanterns glowing at slightly different distances. On a quiet night, their lights might shimmer in a pattern that looks, for an instant, like a single flame. Some theories suggest that déjà vu may occur when the brain processes a moment twice, once through a quick unconscious route and once through a slower conscious one. Instead of imagining this as mechanical error, we can see it as two waves arriving at the same shore from slightly different directions. When their crests rise together, the combined swell feels larger than either wave alone. A moment feels doubled, enriched with a sense of familiarity even though the details are new. But layered on top of this gentle neuroscience is a more dreamy idea. What if déjà vu is a moment when two branches of your life drift close enough to share a whisper? Perhaps in a nearby timeline you made a slightly different choice. A conversation began a second earlier, or you walked through a doorway with a different rhythm in your step. When these nearby possibilities brush against the one you're living, the memory of that other path might pass through like a faint breeze brushing your cheek. Nothing dramatic, just a soft acknowledgement that the world is deeper and more intricate than the story we perceive each day. Imagine too that the mind is like a quiet library filled with shelves stretching in every direction. Each shelf holds many versions of the same story, written with slight variations in the sentences and the ordering of events. Most days we read only one version, the one familiar to our lives. But once in a while, perhaps while waking from a dream or settling into a moment of calm, our fingers brush against a nearby volume. A single phrase from that adjacent book might imprint itself on our thoughts, producing that eerie sense of familiarity we call déjà vu. The mind isn't confused. It's simply noticing a neighbouring page in the grand architecture of possibilities. Even if there is no literal merging of timelines, déjà vu reminds us that memory itself is not as rigid as we imagine. Memories don't sit in neat rows inside the mind. They drift, they blend, they reshape themselves like clouds carried by changing winds. Sometimes, when we experience something new, the mind searches its quiet collection, and finds a memory that shares the same shape, even if the details are different. This overlap can feel uncanny, like hearing a melody that your heart recognizes even though your ears swear they've never heard it before. Science offers many explanations for déjà vu: misfiring neurons, mismatched processing speeds, internal prediction systems, but none of these frameworks diminish its beauty. In fact, they add to it. Because even if déjà vu arises from the mind's delicate architecture, the effect remains the same. A reminder that time is not always as smooth as it seems, and that our perception can catch subtle echoes from the past, or perhaps from nearby possibilities, like tiny bells ringing from another room. You can think of déjà vu as the mind's version of seeing a reflection in a window. Not quite a mirror, not quite the world outside, but a blending of both. For a moment, the lines blur. You see yourself superimposed upon the landscape beyond the glass. Something in you recognizes the overlap, even if only for a heartbeat. And then, just as quickly, the view separates again. The reflection fades, the scene settles back into its familiar shape, and you continue forward along your path. These glimmers do not disrupt the flow of life. They do not shift history or rearrange the world. They simply invite us to wonder, to pause for a breath, and consider the possibility that somewhere, nearby but unseen, another version of a moment might be unfolding. Déjà vu becomes not a glitch, but a gentle invitation to imagine the hidden layers of existence, the ones that slip quietly beneath our everyday awareness, waiting to be noticed in rare, shimmering instants. There are moments when the mind insists on remembering something that the world around you disagrees with. A line from a beloved story that seems slightly different when you hear it again. The spelling of a name that feels wrong even though everyone else says it has always been that way. A memory of an event unfolding in one direction when every record says it happened in another. These small mismatches don't usually disturb the flow of life, but they linger. They sit quietly in the back of the mind like a single note held too long at the end of a song. People often call this collection of shared mismatches the Mandela Effect, a curious phenomenon where many individuals recall the same detail incorrectly, yet with remarkable confidence. Some remember a cartoon character wearing clothes that never appeared in any drawing. Others recall an old children's book title spelled in a way no publisher has ever printed. And for still others, certain events in history seem slightly out of order, like a stack of papers shuffled by a gentle breeze. The Mandela Effect is often explained as a quirk of memory, and that explanation carries its own kind of beauty. Memory is not a perfect recording. It is more like a painting that the brain quietly retouches over time. Each time we revisit a memory, the mind takes the old image and paints it again, adjusting small details without us realizing. The result is a gallery of stories that feel crisp and clear, even if some strokes no longer match the world around us. But when many people share the same altered memory, it creates a sense of mystery, not of fear, but of wonder. How does a group of strangers spread across continents all insist on the same misplaced detail? One gentle explanation comes from neuroscience. Our minds often fill in gaps with familiar patterns. If a name sounds like it should have a certain letter, we paint it that way. If a character feels as though they should have worn something distinctive, we picture them wearing it. These shared assumptions ripple through communities, leading many minds to repaint the same detail in the same way. Yet, in the context of our exploration of parallel timelines, the Mandela Effect becomes something more poetic. Instead of imagining memory errors, we can imagine faint echoes of another version of history, one stored in a neighbouring thread of reality. Not a complete shift or a collision, but a soft blending at the edges. Like two pages in a book pressed together for so long that a bit of ink from one transfers to the other, creating delicate shadows of another story. Picture reality as a long library shelf filled with books, each one telling the story of a world almost identical to ours. Most of the time, we read only from the book labelled with our own timeline. But once in a while, Perhaps when we are tired or nostalgic or drifting somewhere between waking and dreams, our mind brushes against the pages of a nearby volume. A single sentence from that other book might imprint itself on ours, not enough to rewrite the story, but enough to leave a trace. Later, when we recall the memory, it feels strangely vivid, as though we lived it, even though the world around us insists otherwise. This picture doesn't claim that entire worlds swap places or merge dramatically. Instead, it offers a gentle possibility that the mind, sensitive and curious, might sometimes tune itself to faint vibrations from other stories unfolding in the deeper fabric of existence, much like hearing a soft harmony beneath the melody of a familiar song. The harmony is quiet, but it's there, adding depth to what you hear. In the early universe, when space was expanding like warm dough rising in an oven, many regions grew into separate cosmic bubbles. Most drifted apart, never to meet. But occasionally, two bubbles brushed against each other, leaving subtle traces in the cosmic background, patterns of light like fingerprints pressed lightly into the sky. If grand cosmic bubbles can leave such signatures, then in a metaphorical sense, perhaps timelines closer to human experience could leave faint impressions as well. Not on the sky, but on memory. Psychology offers another soft image. Think of the mind as a field of tall grass bending with the wind. Each experience leaves a path through that grass. When two memories share a similar shape, similar footsteps, similar emotions, the paths can appear to overlap. Over time, you might recall walking one path when you actually walked another. It's not confusion. It's simply the mind doing what it has always done, finding patterns, making meaning, weaving coherence out of experiences. But when thousands of people feel that same overlapping path, the sense of mystery deepens. It becomes an unspoken acknowledgement that our minds, though individual, are not isolated. We learn from each other, echo each other, and sometimes reshape memories in ways that spread like ripples through a pond. There is a quiet beauty in accepting both explanations at once. Perhaps the Mandela Effect is partly a shared quirk of memory, the mind's way of polishing stories until they shine. And perhaps it is also something more, a place where the boundaries between possible histories thin just enough for a sliver of another tale to pass through. If the universe contains many branching paths, then every choice, every random moment, every divergent possibility becomes a new thread in the tapestry of existence. Some threads run far apart, never touching again. Others run so close that their colours blend for a heartbeat. When that happens, perhaps a memory from one branch finds its way into another, carried gently across the divide like a drifting feather from a neighbouring valley. Even if the Mandela Effect remains a puzzle, it invites us to hold the mystery lightly. It reminds us that memory is not a fixed structure, but a living, breathing story that grows with us. It reminds us that the world may hold more layers than we can see, and it reminds us that sometimes the mind senses echoes of places it has never been, like hearing distant bells carried on a wind that blows softly from somewhere just beyond the horizon. If you listen closely to the stories carried through time, you'll notice that nearly every culture, from the smallest villages to the grandest civilizations, has held on to tales that seem to sit just outside the boundaries of ordinary experience. These stories do not shout, they do not demand belief. Instead, they linger softly in the background, like faint melodies remembered from childhood. Melodies that feel familiar even if no one can recall where they were first heard. Many of these tales describe moments when the world felt slightly off its axis, as though something had brushed against reality's edge and left a few threads out of place. One old story tells of a traveller who appeared suddenly in a marketplace, speaking a language that no one recognised. His clothes were stitched in patterns unfamiliar to any craftsperson in the city, and the coins in his pocket bore images of rulers no one had ever seen. When questioned, he insisted he had merely walked from a neighbouring town, one that hadn't existed on any map. Just as quietly as he'd arrived, the traveller vanished a few days later, leaving behind nothing but rumours and a handful of impossible coins. To some, this tale is a myth. To others, it is a whisper from a timeline that drifted close enough for someone to slip through. Other stories describe people who went to sleep in their beds and awoke feeling that their homes were somehow different. A window slightly wider, a tree in the yard blooming in a colour they didn't remember, the sound of a nearby river flowing with a rhythm just a bit unfamiliar, like a song played in a different key. These small, strange mismatches rarely caused fear. Instead, they raised quiet questions. Had the world changed? Or had the person simply noticed something they had overlooked before? The boundary between memory and reality is thin, as delicate as fog rising at dawn. In the modern world, we often explain these stories as misremembered details or misunderstandings. And that may be true. Memory is a flexible companion. But as we consider the possibility of parallel timelines drifting close to one another, these tales take on a new, softer meaning. They become threads that might have brushed against our own, leaving faint traces like fingerprints on glass. To imagine how such brushing could occur, think of the world as a grand stage with many overlapping sets. Most of the time, each set remains hidden behind its own curtain, lit only by its own lanterns. But sometimes, when the lighting shifts or the curtains flutter, one set's shadows fall across another. The audience sees a brief, fleeting silhouette that doesn't quite belong. It doesn't stay long. It doesn't disrupt the performance. It simply appears, whispers its presence, and fades again. In physics, this kind of soft crossing is sometimes imagined through the idea of folding space and time. Instead of picturing a straight sheet of cloth, picture one that drapes and curves. If you lift one corner and bring it near another, 2 points once far apart may become close enough to touch. No equations are needed to hold this picture, only the image of fabric gathering softly in your hands. In some theories, such folds in the universe could create rare moments when two regions, or even two versions of events, press together just long enough for something small to drift across. Historical accounts often describe these moments as miracles, apparitions, or omens. In ancient Japan, there were stories of people who stepped into forests at dusk and found themselves lost in places that felt familiar yet altered, as though they had wandered into another layer of the world. In Europe, there were tales of travellers who rode across bridges and emerged into lands where the sky seemed slightly different, or where seasons changed unexpectedly. In the Andes, storytellers spoke of mountains that remembered different versions of villages, holding echoes of paths that no longer existed. These stories were not meant as scientific explanations. They were gentle reflections of something deeper, a shared human intuition that the world might have more layers than we can see, a sense that reality is not always rigid, but sometimes behaves like a soft veil that can shift in a sudden breeze. Even in our own time, people occasionally describe moments that sit just on the edge of the ordinary. A building they've passed hundreds of times suddenly appears with an extra window. A familiar road seems slightly shorter. A conversation feels like it has happened before, but not in the blurry way of déjà vu. More like a memory that belongs to someone with a life similar to theirs, but not identical. These moments are small and easily dismissed, yet they carry a quiet weight, as though they belong to a story that spans more than one version of the world. Of course, these impressions could be nothing more than the mind's habit of filling in details or the natural imperfections of memory. But they could also be hints, soft, subtle hints, that the boundaries of reality are not always perfectly smooth, that sometimes the nearby threads of the cosmic tapestry drift close enough for their colours to mingle. And when they do, human experience, with all its delicate sensitivity, might be the first thing to notice. If parallel timelines exist, their contact does not need to be dramatic. It might be nothing more than the faint shimmer of another path, touching ours for a heartbeat. A whisper from a history that almost, but not quite, was ours, a hint that the universe in all its depth and complexity holds more stories than any one timeline can contain. These legends and accounts remind us that the world has always felt a little mysterious to those willing to listen. They invite us not to prove or disprove anything, but simply to hold the possibility that reality may be broader and softer than it appears, a place where boundaries blur in subtle, fleeting ways, leaving behind only a whisper of wonder. There is a delicate idea in physics that sounds almost like something borrowed from poetry. It suggests that two tiny pieces of the universe, two particles so small that you could never touch them or see them, can become connected in a way that ignores distance entirely. Once linked, they remain in quiet companionship, no matter how far they drift apart. A change in one seems to echo through the other, like two wind chimes tuned to the same hidden note, ringing faintly in unison across a great valley. This phenomenon is called entanglement, but the word can feel sharp, almost mechanical. Here, we can imagine it instead as a thread spun from invisible silk. When two particles share this thread, they become companions in a deeper sense than anything we typically experience in the macroscopic world. Whether separated by the width of a room or the stretch of an entire horizon, they still share the same shimmer of information, the same quiet rhythm. Some scientists explain this connection using diagrams and symbols that map the flow of information across invisible spaces. But a simpler way to hold the idea is to picture a pair of fireflies glowing in perfect synchrony, one fluttering near your hand and the other drifting far away in a dark field. When one firefly brightens its glow, the distant one seems to brighten too, as though they share a hidden pulse. Entanglement whispers that the universe is not a collection of isolated objects, but more like a vast network of subtle connections. Each particle is a bead on a thread, and each thread loops and twists to tie distant places together. And if such threads exist between small, simple particles, it is not so strange to imagine that similar patterns might exist between larger structures, perhaps even between different versions of reality. To understand this possibility, imagine reality itself as a loom. Each possible timeline is a strand, weaving its way through the loom's frame. Most of the time, the strands move independently, crossing only where necessary to construct the pattern we call existence. But if entanglement is like a thread that ties two beads together, then perhaps timelines are tied by threads of their own. Not physical threads, not ropes or wires, but delicate correspondences, events that resonate with one another, choices that mirror each other, moments that form subtle bridges across the spaces, between worlds. Some interpretations of quantum theory imagine the universe branching into many possible futures, all of them unfolding side by side. If that is true, then entanglement may exist not just within a timeline, but across them. You can picture this cross-branch entanglement not as something literal or mechanical, but as the harmonic vibration of two adjacent strings. When one string is plucked, the other begins to hum, even though no fingers touched it. Their resonance travels across the small space separating them, creating a shimmer of connection. Now imagine reality's branches as strings stretched across an enormous cosmic instrument. Most stay quiet, vibrating only in their own pathways. But sometimes two strings might lie close enough that a vibration in one causes the faintest resonance in the other. If this gentle bridge exists, then perhaps certain events in one timeline could leave a delicate trace in another. Not enough to change the world, but enough to create a sense of shared rhythm. A dream remembered a little too vividly, a memory that doesn't quite belong, a coincidence that feels heavier than chance. Of course, entanglement does not involve messages or signals leaping across space. It is not a method of communication. It is more like the quiet symmetry of two dancers who learned the same choreography long ago and still reflect each other's movements with uncanny precision. They do not speak, yet they remain in harmony. In the same way, entangled particles simply share a kind of deep coordination, an agreement written into the fabric of their existence. If timelines share something similar, the connection might not be deliberate or purposeful. It might simply be the universe's way of keeping all its patterns coherent, ensuring that every branch, no matter how faint, still follows the deeper architecture that makes existence possible. This hidden coherence could, in rare moments, produce small ripples, echoes that drift between worlds like soft shadows crossing a lantern's glow. Imagine too that entanglement is a reminder that separation is not as absolute as it appears. Even in our everyday lives, we feel moments of connection that defy explanation. Thinking of someone just as they call, remembering a dream only when someone else describes theirs, sensing a shift in the mood of a place before anything has visibly changed. These sensations aren't scientific proof of anything, but they reveal something about how the mind intuits the world. It is sensitive to patterns, tuned to rhythms we cannot always name. And in that sensitivity, perhaps it sometimes brushes against deeper layers of connection. There's a peacefulness in imagining that the universe is held together by threads of relationship, that nothing is ever entirely alone. Even the smallest particle carries within it the echo of another. Even the faintest possibility may share a resonance with its neighbours, and if parallel timelines exist, quiet pathways running beside our own, then perhaps entanglement is the universe's way of reminding us that all those paths are woven from the same fundamental cloth. As we drift further into this thought, the idea becomes less about particles and more about the nature of connectedness itself. In a universe that refuses to be singular, entanglement becomes a soft clue, a hint that separate things may be part of a greater whole, that beneath the surface of reality there may be a quiet harmony shared between every version of existence. When you picture space, you might imagine a vast darkness stretching in every direction, dotted with distant stars like lanterns floating on an endless sea. You might see planets swirling, galaxies drifting, and light travelling in straight, patient lines across the quiet. But some ideas in physics invite us to think of space not as a rigid expanse, but as something more like fabric, something that can drape, bend, twist and fold in ways that defy the simple geometry we learned as children. If space is a kind of cloth, then it may also hold seams and stitches, shortcuts and folds, hidden beneath its surface like secrets sewn by the universe itself. One of these imagined shortcuts is the wormhole. Instead of picturing it as a mechanical tunnel or some roaring cosmic vortex, imagine it gently, a loop of fabric brought close together so that two distant points touch for a moment. If space is a sheet, then a wormhole is the place where that sheet gathers into a small fold, allowing a traveller to step from one corner to another without walking the long distance between. It is less like drilling a tunnel and more like pinching two edges of a blanket until they meet. The universe might hold many such folds, though they would be delicate, too delicate for ordinary matter, collapsing as soon as they form, unless something stabilizes them. Some physicists have speculated that exotic forms of energy or pressure could keep such a fold open, much like using gentle fingers to hold two sides of a curtain apart. But here, we don't need to focus on the technical details. Instead, we can see wormholes as symbols of connection, of hidden paths that link distant places, or perhaps distant possibilities. If timelines run beside each other like threads in a tapestry, then wormholes could be imagined as tiny bridges where two threads drift close enough to touch. Another idea from theoretical physics describes paths in time that don't move forward in a simple line, but loop back on themselves in soft circular arcs. Instead of picturing time as a straight path or even a rippling stream, imagine it as a ribbon gently curling back toward its own beginning. These loops are sometimes called closed time paths in scientific language, but we can think of them more simply as moments where the ribbon of time folds in a circle. If a traveller were to walk that ribbon, they might return to a moment they had already lived, just as a person walking around a quiet pond eventually ends up where they started. These loops, though elegant in imagination, raise deep questions. If time folds back, does the traveller re-enter the same moment or create a new one? Do they step into the same world or into a branch of reality that mirrors the original but unfolds differently thereafter? In the soft, dreamlike landscape of our exploration, we can imagine these loops as gentle bridges between timelines, places where one version of events might touch another, exchanging subtle echoes. There is also a poetic idea proposed by some researchers that suggests bridges in space could mirror bridges in the quantum world. When two particles become deeply linked, sharing a quiet thread of companionship, some believe that this connection could resemble a tiny bridge, almost like a miniature wormhole. It's not that the particles use this bridge to travel or send messages, but that the geometry of space and the relationships in the quantum world might share a hidden symmetry. Both describe connections that defy distance, links that remain even when everything else drifts apart. This idea helps us see the universe as a place where large and small, near and far, may reflect each other in unexpected ways. It's as if space holds a memory of connection that repeats across many scales, from particles barely larger than a whisper to galaxies swirling across the cosmic sea. If wormholes and time loops exist, even in an abstract sense, they offer us a way to imagine how separate timelines might drift close. Picture the fabric of reality gently folding so that two moments, each from a different branch, touch lightly. For a brief instant, a breath from one timeline might brush against another, like two pages of a book leaning together before settling back to their places. Nothing violent happens, nothing tears. It's simply a soft contact, a fleeting alignment, meaningful precisely because of its rarity. These cosmic gateways also invite us to think about time and space as more flexible than they appear. In everyday life, we see time as a sequence of moments marching forward, and space as a stage upon which events unfold. But if the universe can fold, twist, or bridge itself in gentle ways, then the simple picture of a straight timeline becomes less certain. Perhaps behind the scenes, the deeper architecture of reality is layered, curved, and interconnected, like the hidden supports of a grand cathedral. In this cathedral, wormholes would be the quiet archways between distant halls. Time loops would be spiral staircases returning gently to earlier floors. The connections between particles would be the delicate tracery carved into the walls, tiny but intricate patterns that reveal the unity of the entire structure. And the convergence of timelines would be like two beams of coloured light, crossing through the stained glass, briefly blending into a new hue before continuing their separate paths. These images help us feel the wonder behind the science, without needing to follow the complex calculations that describe how these structures might form. They let us sense the universe's architecture as something alive, something capable of surprising us with hidden corridors and softly curving passageways. If parallel timelines exist, and if the universe contains folds and bridges, then perhaps those timelines could touch, not in thunderous collisions, but in subtle alignments, like two drifting boats brushing gently on a calm lake. The contact would be brief, almost imperceptible, but the trace it leaves might echo through memory, through feeling, through the quiet spaces where intuition speaks louder than logic. And as we imagine these gateways, these folds, loops, and hidden corridors, we step a little closer to understanding how vast and mysterious reality may be, and how gently its many layers might meet. If you imagine the earliest moments of the universe, try not to picture loud explosions or violent flashes of light. Instead, imagine a warm and silent field stretching in every direction, like dough rising slowly in a sunlit kitchen. This field expands not because of force, but because of a gentle swelling, an effortless unfolding that fills space with possibility. Physicists call this early expansion inflation, but the word itself feels abrupt, almost like a balloon being blown up. Here we can imagine it as the quiet rising of something soft, patient, and full of potential. As this cosmic dough rose, different regions stretched and separated, each carrying its own tiny imprints of temperature and density. These regions were like bubbles forming in a warm pot of milk, small at first, then growing, drifting, and moving apart. Some bubbles floated far from each other, their boundaries never touching, but others grew close enough that their edges pressed against one another like soap bubbles meeting under a child's breath. In the landscape of the universe, these bubbles are not literal spheres of foam, but soft metaphors for regions where space-time evolved in slightly different ways. Each bubble became a universe of its own, complete with its own rhythm, its own unfolding story, and perhaps its own subtle variations in the laws of nature. Some bubbles expanded faster, some slower. Some cooled in different patterns, and once in a great while, two bubbles may have drifted close enough that their expanding edges touched, like two glowing lanterns brushing in the night. When two soap bubbles meet, they don't explode. Instead, their surfaces merge in graceful arcs, forming a shared boundary that glimmers for a moment before separating again. In the same way, if two cosmic bubbles touched during the early swelling of space, they might have created a region where their different patterns blended softly. Not an impact, not a rupture, just a gentle joining, mingling of textures in the cosmic fabric. Scientists look for signs of these ancient meetings in the faint glow left over from the early universe, light that has travelled for billions of years to reach us. This ancient light is often described as a soft, even background, like a fine mist of warmth spread thinly across the sky. But within this mist are subtle patterns, tiny fluctuations in temperature that carry stories from the early universe. Some researchers believe that if two cosmic bubbles brushed together long ago, the shared boundary would leave a gentle imprint in this mist, like a fingerprint pressed lightly onto glass. In technical terms, these imprints show up as circular patterns or small anomalies that differ from the usual mottled texture. But instead of focusing on measurements and symbols, imagine the sky as a vast canvas illuminated by an ancient lantern. Most of the canvas shows the natural grain of the cloth, small speckles of light and shade. But in one corner you notice a faint ring, as though someone touched the surface with the rim of a cup long ago. That ring could be the whisper of another bubble, brushing ours in the childhood of the cosmos. This idea of bubbles meeting also helps us imagine how timelines might behave when they drift near each other. If universes themselves can touch gently, blending their patterns for a heartbeat, then it is not so unthinkable that smaller scale realities, timelines in the same universe, could also brush against each other in quiet ways. Instead of soap bubbles, think of these timelines as ripples in a pond. Two stones dropped at different moments create expanding circles. Most ripples pass each other without notice, but sometimes two ripples meet, and when they do, they form new shapes, rising and falling in patterns neither stone created alone. These ripple patterns are brief, delicate, and almost impossible to predict. Yet if you watch them closely, you notice something enchanting. The meeting point of two ripples is not chaotic, but surprisingly graceful. The joining of two waves becomes its own little dance, a place where influence passes between them like a soft handshake. In the same way, if timelines ever come close enough, whether through cosmic geometry, the folding of space, or the resonance of possibilities, they might form gentle interference patterns. These patterns would not be visible through telescopes or instruments. Instead, they might show up as slight distortions in experience, as if two versions of events produced a shared echo. A moment that feels unusually layered, a decision that seems heavier than usual, a memory that appears to have two different edges, like twin shadows cast from slightly different angles. Bubble collisions in the early universe serve as a cosmic metaphor for this possibility. They remind us that the universe is capable of hosting multiple, coexisting structures, each with its own story and trajectory. And they remind us that contact between these structures when it happens can be subtle and beautiful. A quiet signature. A trace left behind in light that has travelled across 13 billion years. If the universe truly grew from a vast rising field, with bubbles drifting and brushing, then perhaps reality itself has always held space for gentle meetings between separate stories. Whether those stories belong to different universes or simply to different branches of our own timeline, the principle remains the same, where edges touch, patterns change, and those patterns, whether imprinted in ancient cosmic light or in the quiet recesses of human experience, remind us that the universe has always been more than a single path. It is a collection of expanding stories, overlapping in ways that reveal how vast, interconnected, and dreamlike existence can be. Memory is one of the quiet miracles of being human. It feels solid, dependable, like a book kept carefully on a shelf. You reach for a page, open it, and there the story is. Unchanged, familiar, yours. But the deeper truth is that memory is less like ink on paper and more like paint on a canvas that is refreshed each time you look at it. Every recollection is a gentle act of retelling. Every memory breathes and shifts, the way colours deepen in different light. And when timelines drift close to one another, even briefly, that delicate process of recollection can begin to tremble. Imagine waking one morning and being convinced that a picture frame in your home once hung on the opposite wall, or feeling certain that a friend's laugh used to sound slightly different, lighter, or deeper than the one you hear today. These aren't dramatic changes, just small misalignments, like a piano key that hums half a tone off from the melody you remember. Most of the time, we brush these feelings aside. We chalk them up to forgetfulness, sleepiness, or a trick of the senses, yet they linger in the corners of awareness, little murmurs that something is not quite the same. Neuroscience offers a gentle language for this phenomenon. The brain stores memories not as perfect recordings, but as a collection of impressions, sights, sounds, emotions, that it pieces together each time we retrieve them. The process is a bit like a librarian tasked with keeping two versions of the same book. When she goes to return one copy to the shelf, she hesitates. A paragraph from one seems familiar, but so does a sentence from the other. For a moment, she isn't entirely sure which page belongs to which story. Memory conflict can feel exactly like this hesitating librarian, holding two versions of the same moment, unsure which to keep and which to soften. If timelines ever drift close to each other, even for an instant, this kind of internal conflict could become slightly more noticeable. Not as anything frightening, but as a gentle tug between two possible recollections. You might remember turning left on your walk home yesterday, yet feel an odd certainty that you once turned right. Both memories sit side by side for a brief moment, like overlapping footprints in soft sand. The brain chooses one path to hold on to, and the other fades like a shadow at dusk. This sensation mirrors something we've seen in earlier explorations of parallel realities. When two threads of the cosmic tapestry come close enough, their colours might mingle along a tiny stretch. The blend isn't permanent. It doesn't rewrite history. It simply creates a small region where distinctions blur, a place where your mind might catch a whisper of the neighbouring thread. Identity, too, can feel the quiet tremors of such brushing. We often imagine identity as a single, consistent story. But in reality, it behaves more like a river. It flows, bends, narrows, widens. It changes its tone depending on the light and the stones beneath its surface. Who you were last year is not exactly who you are today, and who you are today is not quite who you will be tomorrow. Even without the idea of multiple timelines, identity is a fluid, living thing. But if another version of you, walking a slightly different path in a nearby branch of reality, comes close enough for its story to brush against yours, the sense of self may ripple ever so gently. You might feel a brief moment of inner dissonance, as though you are standing between two mirrors reflecting slightly different angles of the same image. Both reflections look like you, yet something feels subtly altered. A different hairstyle, a different expression, a different emotion flickering in the eyes. These internal shifts often pass quickly. They resolve themselves as the brain filters through its library, smoothing out the edges until one clear story emerges. Most people experience such moments without giving them much thought. They feel like softness at the edge of perception, a shadow passing across the surface of awareness. You might even experience this through something as simple as waking up in the morning and hesitating for a heartbeat before remembering which side of the bed you slept on, or feeling momentarily uncertain whether a favourite mug has always had a tiny crack near its handle. These everyday uncertainties are normal. They remind us that the mind is dynamic, not static. But in a universe where timelines can drift like delicate threads through the same loom, such hesitations gain a poetic resonance. Another way to understand these moments is to picture your memory as a small garden. Each memory is a plant rooted in soil, growing in its own patch of sunlight. But nearby, in the garden of a parallel version of your life, similar plants might grow, slightly taller, slightly shorter, blooming at slightly different times. If the wind carries a seed or a scent from that neighbouring garden, your senses might momentarily confuse the two. You catch the fragrance of a flower you thought had not bloomed yet. You recognise a leaf shape that feels familiar, but slightly off. The blending is subtle, but it's enough to make you pause. When memories don't match perfectly, the mind does what it has always done. It chooses the version that fits best with the rest of your experiences. The other version fades into the background like a faint echo. But sometimes, that echo lingers just long enough to provoke curiosity. Just long enough to remind you that the story of your life is not fixed but flexible. That it can bend and reshape itself like branches shifting in the wind. From a cosmic viewpoint, this flexibility is a gift. It allows the mind to adapt, to grow, to integrate new experiences. It allows for imagination, creativity, and empathy, for seeing not just the world that is, but the worlds that could have been. And it allows you to hold two memories side by side for a moment, before choosing the one that feels truest. In a universe layered with possibilities, perhaps these inner earthquakes, the quiet, private tremors where memory hesitates, are simply reminders that our lives are not as single-threaded as they appear. They remind us that even within ourselves there is room for more than one story to breathe. When we think about history, we tend to picture it as a long scroll that unrolls in a steady, uninterrupted line. Events follow one another, each neatly stacked upon the last, forming the story of a civilization. But the truth is gentler and far more fragile. History, like memory, is a living narrative, retold, revised, and reinterpreted with each generation. It breathes and shifts as new voices join the chorus. And if parallel timelines drift close to ours, even for a moment, the story of society might feel a faint tremor, as though the scroll had been brushed by another version of the tale. Imagine waking up to find that a famous monument in your city appears slightly different. Its stones are weathered in a pattern you don't quite remember. A small carving near its base looks unfamiliar, even though everyone else insists it has been there for decades. Or consider the feeling of reading a familiar story from childhood and sensing that a detail, a minor character, a place name, has subtly changed, as though a gentle hand turned the page and rewrote a single line while you were sleeping. These are small things, harmless, easy to dismiss. Yet in a world where timelines may sometimes move close enough to brush the edges of one another, such subtle shifts could be the faintest echoes of another version of history touching ours. Not enough to change the world in any dramatic or frightening way, just enough to create a soft ripple, the way a river changes course by a few inches overnight, unnoticed unless you look closely. Picture the timeline of human society as a river winding through a valley. Its banks shift gradually over years, sometimes so slowly that only a keen observer notices the change. But if another river, flowing through a neighbouring valley, comes close enough to touch, the water might mingle for a brief moment. The river bends slightly. A new channel forms. When they separate again, the change remains. A gentle reminder that even great forces can shift with the lightest of touches. In the context of converging timelines, such shifts wouldn't alter everything at once. They would appear in the smallest corners of everyday life. A historical photo where someone's clothing looks slightly different from what you learned in school. A word in an old speech that sounds changed, as though the speaker had made a slightly different choice of phrasing in another version of the world. These moments do not demand alarm, they simply invite reflection. There is also the subtle possibility that certain inventions, artworks, or ideas might appear or disappear in ways that feel like slips in the world's rhythm. Not abrupt or magical, merely quiet absences or arrivals. You might remember a particular brand of cereal from your childhood, only to find that nobody else recalls it. A short song from an old movie may feel missing from the soundtrack you now hear, or a phrase that you are certain existed in a well-known poem is nowhere to be found in any printed edition. Social historians sometimes describe these sensations as cultural memory gaps, moments where communities collectively misremember something together. But in the soft landscape of converging timelines, these gaps can be imagined as gentle places where two versions of history overlapped briefly before parting ways again. Like two dancers brushing fingertips as they pass, leaving behind a light impression of a pattern neither fully completes. Consider too the way technological shifts could feel under such conditions. What if a device you remember using frequently in childhood seems strangely absent from the memories of those around you? Or what if a technology that feels new to you has apparently been around for years, with people speaking of it as though it has always been a part of everyday life? In a converged timeline, such experiences might be the faint residue of a world where invention arrived sooner or later than in your own. Yet none of these shifts would cause upheaval or chaos. They would be soft, almost graceful, like a map where rivers gently change course overnight. People would continue their lives, adjusting naturally, the way we always have when the world changes subtly around us. The mind is wonderfully adaptable. When it encounters small inconsistencies, it smooths them into coherence, creating a story that feels continuous even when tiny details have rearranged themselves. Culture too would adapt. Traditions would shift slightly, perhaps reflecting echoes of other branches of history. Folk songs might carry melodies that feel ancient and familiar, yet also strange, as though borrowed from a place that never quite existed. Holidays might have small variations in meaning across different communities, shaped by influences we no longer remember clearly. The edges of these cultural differences would blur, softened by time, until they feel as natural as the lines worn into an old wooden table. And if someone noticed these differences and wondered aloud why things felt a little off, society would respond in its usual gentle way. Some would attribute the feelings to nostalgia or imagination. Others would nod, sensing they too had felt that same quiet ripple. The mystery would remain, but it would not disrupt the flow of life. Instead, it would become part of the atmosphere of existence, an unspoken acknowledgement that reality may be more fluid than it appears. If timelines do converge, even for brief moments, their effects on society would not be loud or dramatic. They would be subtle changes in stories, artifacts, memories, and cultural rhythms. These changes would drift through the collective consciousness like distant echoes, barely audible, but present nonetheless. And in these soft societal shifts, we might find something unexpectedly beautiful. A sense that humanity is part of a larger, more complex story. a story not confined to one path, but woven from many threads, each interacting gently with the others, shaping our shared world in ways that are both mysterious and deeply human. When you look at the natural world, it often feels steady and predictable. Seasons follow one another with patient rhythm. Birds return to familiar branches. Rivers carve their paths year after year. Even the stars seem to move with the calm certainty of a well-practiced ritual. But if parallel timelines ever drift close enough to touch, the first place we might sense a subtle change is not in our memories or our conversations, but in the quiet behaviour of nature, the world's oldest storyteller. Imagine waking one morning to the sound of birdsong outside your window. You hear a melody that feels almost right, yet one note lingers a little longer than you remember. The tune is familiar, but something about it has changed, like a childhood lullaby sung in a slightly different key. Perhaps the birds themselves have not changed, only the tiny details of their patterns, their routes through the sky, their rhythms, their instincts shaped by centuries of subtle environmental cues. In a reality where timelines brush against one another, such small changes might be the softest sign that nature's script has shifted. Picture the world as a grand garden, each ecosystem a carefully tended section. Forests with their layers of leaves, oceans with their silent choreography of currents, deserts breathing heat into the air. These systems are sensitive, like instruments tuned to very precise notes. If two timelines converge even briefly, each with its own slightly different history of rainfall, wind, migration or climate, the merged result might feel like a faint alteration in the garden's scent. Not a drastic change, nothing alarming, just a small difference you notice only when you pause long enough to listen. One way to imagine this is through fine-tuning, a term scientists use to describe how delicate the conditions of the universe are. Instead of imagining equations, picture a recipe. The universe, like a baker crafting a loaf of bread, must balance ingredients with extraordinary precision. Warmth, density, time, and the subtle forces that hold everything together. Each universe that forms might follow the same recipe, but with slight variations, a little more heat, a little less pressure, a slight shift in how particles behave. These differences are subtle, almost imperceptible, yet they shape everything from the colour of starlight to the chemistry of oceans. When two timelines press lightly against each other, their recipes might blend for a moment, producing outcomes that feel familiar but slightly altered. Perhaps a plant you've seen bloom for years opens its petals a day earlier than expected. Perhaps a certain species of butterfly appears in your garden, despite not being common in your region. Or maybe a tree, once known for shedding its leaves in early autumn, now holds them a little longer, as though remembering two different rhythms at once. Geology too might feel these faint ripples. A mountain that has stood silent and unmoving for millions of years may appear unchanged, yet the way sunlight reflects off its slopes could seem shifted, as if the angle of the rock had been carved by a slightly different history of wind. A familiar shoreline might curve a few inches differently, shaped by tides and storms from a nearby version of the world where weather followed a slightly different pattern. These shifts would not be large enough to notice in everyday life, only enough to stir a quiet sense of unfamiliar familiarity. Weather, that ever-changing ballet of air and cloud, might also carry echoes from converging timelines, a storm that seems strangely out of season, a warm day arriving earlier than expected, or a cool evening lingering longer. Of course, weather is always fluctuating. It needs no cosmic explanation. But in the context of parallel realities brushing against one another, these natural surprises gain a poetic resonance. They become small reminders that the world is shaped by countless delicate influences, some perhaps more subtle than we realise. Even landscapes might hold faint memories of other possibilities. A valley you've known all your life might feel subtly different in its contours, as though shaped by a different pattern of rainfall or a different course of a river long ago. A forest path might twist slightly differently than you recall, its trees arranged in a pattern you cannot quite reconcile. These impressions would be fleeting, like noticing that the texture of a familiar quilt feels slightly smoother or rougher in a new light. In the animal kingdom, instincts might carry soft echoes from another branch of reality. Birds migrating along a route that shifts by just a few miles. Fish swimming slightly differently than before, following currents that feel altered yet natural. Insects arriving a week earlier, as if remembering a climate from a timeline where the seasons warmed sooner. These patterns would weave into the world seamlessly, noticed only by those attuned to the smallest details. And perhaps the most delicate sign would be found in the silence between sounds, the way the world feels when you stand outside at dusk listening to the hum of life settling into night. If timelines converge, even briefly, the tone of that silence might shift in barely perceptible ways. The air might feel a little heavier, or a degree lighter, the way it does when you visit a place with a slightly different elevation or humidity. Not enough to startle, only enough to make you linger a moment longer, wondering why the evening feels new. These soft environmental changes would not disrupt life. They would not tear through ecosystems or create chaos. Instead, they would be like a gentle breeze passing through two nearby fields, carrying grains of pollen from one to the other. A blending, not a breaking. A harmony, not a clash. In this sense, nature becomes the quiet witness to the tapestry of timelines. It holds the echoes more gently than memory or culture, translating subtle differences into the growth of a leaf, the migration of a bird, or the pattern of frost on a window pane. And if we pay attention to these small, delicate shifts, we might sense the deeper truth that every version of the world carries its own music, sometimes distinct, sometimes softly intertwined. The human mind is a quiet marvel. It handles countless tasks without ever announcing what it's doing. It listens, remembers, plans, imagines, and organises the flow of life with subtlety and grace. Most of the time, the mind works by shaping the world into a single coherent story. It gathers every moment, every thought, every emotion, and arranges them carefully, like a librarian placing books neatly on a shelf. But if two timelines drift close enough to touch, even for the smallest fraction of a second, this quiet librarian may find herself holding two versions of the same book, each with slightly different chapters, and feeling unsure which one belongs in the story of you. Imagine her standing at her desk, two copies of a biography resting before her. In one copy, a childhood memory has a particular detail, a birthday celebration at one house. In the other copy, the same celebration takes place at a slightly different location. Both stories feel true. Both stories seem familiar. The librarian hesitates. For a moment, she's at the threshold between two realities, and the mind, in its gentle way, sorts through the pages, choosing which version to keep and which to let fade like ink dissolving in water. This threshold is not dramatic. It does not feel like stepping between worlds in a science fiction tale. It feels more like standing in a doorway between two quiet rooms, each lit by a different kind of afternoon light. You sense both rooms at once, then gradually one glow becomes the one you recognize more deeply, and the other softens into the background. Psychologists sometimes describe the mind as a system that seeks coherence. When it encounters conflicting information, it does not panic. Instead, it smooths the edges, creating a narrative that flows gently from one moment to the next. This smoothing process is like a river merging with a smaller stream. Both waters mix for a while, swirling together, but eventually they find a single course. If timelines converge briefly, this smoothing may become more noticeable. You might feel a moment of inner dissonance, a soft flutter in your thoughts, as though your mind is pausing to decide which stream to follow. There is a special kind of quiet that happens during these moments, something like the silence that comes just before snowfall. The world holds its breath. The mind waits. Then, slowly and gracefully, a sense of clarity returns. This clarity is not forced. It rises naturally, the way mist lifts from the surface of a lake when the morning sun touches it. Another way to imagine this threshold is as a meditation hall within yourself, a place where your thoughts sit in a circle like monks, each holding a candle. One candle might flicker slightly differently, casting shadows that seem unfamiliar. Another candle might glow a little brighter than it did yesterday. These small variations do not disrupt the meditation. They simply become part of the room's gentle illumination. In the same way, when the mind encounters two versions of a memory or two impressions of reality, it takes a moment to observe them, breathe with them, and then allow one to settle into place. Some people describe moments when they feel unusually aware of themselves, almost as if they are watching their own thoughts from a small distance. This quiet self-observation can feel like floating gently above your life, seeing it from a wider perspective. In a universe where multiple realities might brush against one another, these moments gain a new kind of beauty. Perhaps they represent times when the mind momentarily perceives more than one possible path. Not in a confusing way, but in a spacious, contemplative way, like taking in a landscape from a hilltop instead of from the winding path below. These experiences could make a person feel more introspective, more receptive to subtle details, more connected to the deeper currents of their own story. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, many would feel a sense of soft wonder, as though glimpsing a broader version of who they are. The boundaries of identity might stretch slightly, like fabric being gently pulled, not torn, not distorted, just widened enough to let in a bit more light. The brain itself might respond to these moments with heightened creativity. When two different streams of possibility brush against one another, inspiration often follows. A painter might see colours in a new way. A writer might imagine an unexpected storyline. A musician might hear a melody they don't remember learning. It is as though the mind, when touching more than one version of reality, gains access to ideas that bloom in the space between them. Even decision-making could feel different for a moment. You might find yourself pausing longer before choosing a path, sensing that more than one outcome feels equally real. Yet this pause would not bring anxiety. It would feel contemplative, like standing before two beautiful views and taking the time to appreciate both before moving on. The mind is more resilient than we often think. It is capable of holding conflicting impressions without losing its center. It adapts gracefully, weaving a coherent narrative even when reality offers more than one thread to follow. And in a universe where timelines sometimes drift close, the mind becomes a bridge, a quiet meeting place where traces of different stories briefly coexist before merging into a single meaningful flow. This ability to hold multiple realities gently is not a flaw, it is a strength. It shows that we are built not just to perceive the world as it is, but to imagine what it could be. It shows that consciousness is not a narrow beam, but a lantern with a wide, soft glow. And it shows that the threshold between different versions of ourselves is not a boundary to fear, but a space where understanding deepens, where awareness becomes richer, and where the quiet miracle of being human reveals itself in full. When the world changes in subtle ways, scientists often find themselves standing at the edge of a quiet mystery. They are trained to measure, to test, to examine, but they are also trained to listen, to notice the softest tremors beneath the surface of the ordinary. And if timelines ever converged, even in gentle, nearly imperceptible ways, science would be among the first fields to feel the shift. Not because instruments would immediately sound alarms, but because patterns would begin to drift in small, intriguing directions. A measurement repeated for decades might return a value just a shade different than expected. A long study process might behave as though it remembers two histories instead of one. Imagine a physicist sitting alone in her observatory late at night. She studies the data from a distant star whose rhythm has always been steady. like a heartbeat echoing through space. But one evening she notices a slight change, a tiny alteration in the pattern. The star twinkles at a rhythm that feels almost familiar, yet not quite the same. She leans closer, wondering whether she misread the numbers, or perhaps whether the star itself is whispering something new. In a blended reality, such small shifts could be the earliest hints that the universe has stitched two stories together, leaving faint seams that shimmer in the starlight. Scientists might begin to observe anomalies that do not fit neatly into existing theories. Instead of reacting with alarm, they would approach these puzzles the way one approaches an unfamiliar melody, listening, tracing its shape, waiting for the pattern to reveal itself. Often, new discoveries begin quietly. A slight bend in a graph, a pattern that repeats too perfectly, a result that seems to come from nowhere and yet feels oddly meaningful. These subtle signals would be like morning light slipping through a curtain, illuminating dust in the air in patterns you hadn't noticed before. In a converged timeline, the natural laws themselves might remain stable, steady foundations that hold the world together, but the specific details, values that describe how particles behave or how forces interact, might shift just slightly, like the tuning of an instrument played by two musicians instead of one. Not discordant, just richer, carrying a deeper harmony. Scientists would work patiently to understand these new harmonies, adjusting their models and theories the way an artist learns to paint with a new shade of colour. To picture this, imagine an enormous tapestry woven with threads of many colours. Most of the threads run straight and smooth, forming the patterns that define the universe's familiar laws. But if two versions of reality merge, some threads might change direction slightly, or new colours might weave into the pattern. The tapestry would still hold together, it might even appear more intricate. But a careful observer would notice that the design has grown more complex, as though someone added a new motif overnight. Researchers studying the mind and consciousness might also notice quiet changes. They might discover that people are more frequently experiencing intuitive insights, or recalling dreams with unusual clarity, or sensing connections between events that previously felt unrelated. These experiences would not replace scientific reasoning. They would simply add another dimension to how people perceive the world. It would be as though the boundary between the rational and the intuitive had softened, allowing both to coexist with more ease. In laboratories across the world, experiments might produce results that seem to hover between two interpretations. Instead of clearly choosing one outcome, they might momentarily reflect the influence of two underlying possibilities. Imagine dropping a pebble into a pond and watching two ripple patterns, not one, emerge from the same point, overlapping in delicate symmetrical arcs. These overlapping ripples might be the scientific equivalent of timelines blending, two narratives touching in a way that creates a new, graceful pattern. Astronomers might see unusual alignments in the sky, stars that shine with a slightly different hue, or galaxies whose shapes appear subtly shifted, as though sculpted by another history's winds. These changes would be soft, gradual, almost dreamlike. No dramatic upheavals, only a gentle feeling that the cosmos is revealing a deeper layer of itself. And through all these observations, scientists would gradually piece together a new understanding of reality, one in which the universe is not a single, unbroken story, but a layered composition. Like a symphony written across many staves, they would learn to read the new celestial language that emerges as timelines intertwine. This language would not appear as symbols on a chalkboard or as complex equations. It would appear as patterns, soft gradients in cosmic light, shifting correlations in natural phenomena, echoes of possibility woven into the shape of matter itself. In time, this new dawn of science would inspire a profound shift in perspective. Researchers would begin to think of the universe not only as something to be measured, but as something to be felt. They would see themselves as explorers in a place where reality is not rigid but responsive, where new pathways can open, and where different versions of the world can influence one another in subtle, beautiful ways. This shift would not dismantle science, it would deepen it. It would remind scientists that at the heart of every great discovery lies curiosity, a willingness to stand before the unknown with quiet humility, to listen, to observe, and to let the universe reveal its secrets in its own time. And as these new scientific insights unfold, humanity would find itself standing in a world that feels slightly larger, slightly more mysterious, and infinitely more interconnected than before. There is a quiet mystery that lingers beneath our understanding of reality. The question of whether the universe simply unfolds around us, or whether it listens, ever so subtly, to the way we look at it. Some scientists speak of a gentle principle in nature suggesting that observation can shape what we see, the way a lantern changes the shadows on the wall simply by being lit. When we consider the possibility of converging timelines, this idea takes on a new, dreamlike tenderness. Could our attention influence which version of the world settles into place? Could our choices, our thoughts, or even our quiet presence gently guide the patterns of a blended reality? To explore this, imagine standing at a crossroads where two paths stretch out in front of you. One road bends slightly to the left, shaded by tall trees. The other curves gently to the right, illuminated by the warm glow of morning sunlight. You haven't yet chosen which path to walk, and for a moment, both possibilities feel equally real. You can almost imagine your footsteps beginning in either direction. In this moment of unchosen potential, your awareness hovers like a lantern suspended between two landscapes. It does not force either one into existence. It simply illuminates both, making them shimmer with the promise of becoming. Some descriptions of the universe imagine every decision branching into multiple futures, but the more poetic view is that our awareness glides softly along these branches, choosing not through force or calculation, but through attention, emotion, and subtle intention. When you focus your gaze on one path, when you lean toward it with curiosity or hope, that path seems to brighten just a little. It becomes the story that welcomes you. The other path does not vanish. It simply fades into the background, becoming one of the countless possibilities the world held but did not choose this time. If timelines converge, even briefly, our awareness may play a small part in guiding how the blended reality settles. Not by commanding or controlling it, but by being present. Much like a musician listening closely to find the right pitch, your mind may tune itself to the version of events that feels most coherent, most meaningful, most deeply aligned with what you understand to be true. There is a gentle idea in philosophy that perception is not passive. It is an ongoing conversation between the mind and the world. You observe something, the world responds, and your observation shifts in turn. This exchange continues endlessly, like waves on a shoreline. When two versions of reality brush together, two stories with slightly different details, the mind may help the world decide which story becomes the shared reality. Not through force, through resonance. To understand this resonance, imagine two lanterns shining in a foggy field. Their lights overlap, creating a patch of brighter mist where the two beams meet. If you stand in that shared glow, the combined light becomes the version of the field you experience. Your presence, simply by being there, makes the shared illumination more real. Awareness becomes like a tuning fork, vibrating gently in harmony with the possibility that feels most complete. This does not mean that we can reshape entire timelines with a mere thought. Rather, it suggests that when timelines meet softly, the human mind may feel out the version that makes the most sense for the story it has been telling. In this way, your consciousness is like a reader holding two versions of the same chapter. You read both, sense which fits better with the chapters before and after, and gently choose. The chosen version becomes your path forward. The other remains a whisper, a faint memory of what could have been. Some thinkers describe this moment of influence as a quiet act of participation. Not control, not domination, participation. When you make a choice, large or small, you're not simply selecting from a set of pre-written outcomes. You're co-authoring the story with the universe. And when two timelines drift close enough for their stories to mingle, your choices help determine what the blended narrative becomes. Consider the simple act of kindness. A gesture so small, a hand on a shoulder, a warm word spoken at the right moment, can influence someone's life in ways that ripple outward, shaping events in ways you will never fully see. These ripples are like tiny adjustments in the melody of the world. If timelines converge, such gestures may guide the blending, drawing the shared reality toward compassion, coherence and beauty. Not because kindness has magical power, but because kindness harmonizes with the deeper rhythms of human experience. Similarly, intention may play a quiet role. When you hold an intention gently, not demanding, not forcing, it becomes like a soft breeze influencing the direction of a drifting leaf. The leaf does not leap or change course abruptly. It simply adjusts its path slightly, gliding toward the direction the breeze suggests. In a blended timeline, intention could serve as that breeze, guiding the settling of reality toward the version that resonates most peacefully. There is also the possibility that consciousness itself, whatever it may be at its core, acts as a bridge between multiple versions of the world. If awareness is capable of holding more than one possibility at once, then perhaps it can also help integrate them. When two timelines come close, your consciousness might smooth the overlap, merging the threads in a way that feels seamless. The result would not feel foreign or disorienting, it would feel natural, as though things had always been this way. And in this gentle dance between mind and world, a deeper truth emerges, that reality is not fixed but responsive, not rigid but alive, not indifferent but intimately connected to the way we move through it. When timelines touch, they do not demand answers or force choices. They simply invite us to participate in the quiet shaping of the story. There comes a moment in every long journey when the path begins to level out, and the traveller feels a quiet shift inside, a soft settling, like sand drifting to the bed of a clear stream. After wandering through the landscapes of parallel timelines, cosmic bridges, shifting memories, and blended realities, it's natural to feel a gentle need to return, not with urgency, but with the kind of peaceful exhale that follows understanding. And in that settling, the world feels a little different, as though it has expanded around us while also drawing closer, becoming both larger and more familiar at the same time. If timelines ever touched, even briefly, the universe would respond not with chaos, but with a slow and graceful return to harmony. Imagine a vast orchestra playing 100 melodies at once, not in disorder but in a swelling cloud of sound where each instrument searches for its place. Slowly, gradually, the melodies begin to align. A rhythm emerges, a soft theme rises and spreads, and suddenly the many voices become one warm, resonant chord. The universe in this way learns how to rest. It settles back into a pattern that feels whole, even if it now holds memories of many songs, and as the universe settles, so do we. Human beings have a remarkable talent for finding balance, even after encountering something mysterious or unfamiliar. When confronted with ideas that stretch the imagination, timelines merging, histories shifting, memories hesitating between versions, we do not break. Instead, we let the mind stretch gently, like a cat arching its back after waking from sleep. We adapt. We reshape our understanding, not through force, but through quiet acceptance. Think of yourself as a boat floating on a wide lake at dusk. The water might have carried you across ripples from many directions, some small, some larger, But eventually the waves subside. The surface becomes smooth again, mirroring the colours of the fading sky. The boat hasn't forgotten the journey. It simply rests now, supported by waters that have returned to calm. In the same way, after exploring the delicate possibilities of converging realities, your mind finds its own stillness, its own place to drift gently into comfort. Throughout our journey, we have imagined time as a river, as a ribbon, as a fabric that bends and folds. We've imagined timelines as threads, as ripples, as paths winding through forests. Each image offered a different way of seeing the world, a reminder that reality is not a single shape but an entire garden of possibilities. And now, as we come to rest, these images weave together into something simple and reassuring. No matter how many branches reality may hold, every person experiences the branch beneath their feet as home. The idea that reality feels whole to the one who lives it is not just philosophical, it is deeply human. Even if there are countless versions of the world, even if some drift close enough to share their shadows or their whispers, you live within one story at a time. Your senses guide you gently. Your memories organize themselves into a coherent narrative. Your heart anchors you to the present moment. And so, the merging of timelines, if it ever happens, does not tear us away from who we are. It simply widens the space inside us where understanding can grow. It invites us to see ourselves as part of something larger, something interconnected, something filled with quiet possibilities. But it also reminds us that we belong fully and peacefully to the story we are living right now. In this softened view of existence, even the mysteries become comforting. The subtle changes, the strange déjà vu, the gentle shifts in memory or environment, all of them can be held lightly, like pebbles picked up beside a stream. You turn them in your hand, admire their shapes, and then carry them with you or let them fall. There is no pressure to solve every riddle, just the calm understanding that the universe is wider than we can grasp and kinder than we often realize. And when you look up at the night sky, at those ancient lanterns shining across distances too immense to imagine, you might feel the sense that every star is part of a larger pattern. Perhaps the stars themselves have witnessed many versions of reality passing by, merging, separating, drifting through cosmic winds, yet they continue to shine, steady and patient, guiding travellers through the ages. Their constancy reminds us that even in a universe full of shifting possibilities, there is always a point of stillness to return to. You may also find that after exploring these ideas, ordinary life feels a little more magical. A familiar street corner might seem to hold a secret. A quiet conversation might feel layered with meaning. A favourite object might carry a sense of history deeper than its surface suggests. These sensations aren't signs of instability. They're moments of presence. Moments when the boundary between imagination and understanding becomes soft enough to let wonder seep through. And as the world settles into its own gentle rhythm, so do you. The mind becomes calm, like a tide retreating into the embrace of the sea. Breathing becomes slower, thoughts unravel and lie down. The story of converging timelines becomes part of a larger story, your story, a story made of curiosity, reflection, and quiet awe. In the end, the universe doesn't ask you to hold all of its mysteries at once. It only asks you to rest within the one that surrounds you now, to let your thoughts drift like leaves floating in a slow river, to settle into the comfort that comes when the world feels wide, but your place in it feels clear. In this soft understanding, the universe settles, and so do you.